Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It is my great pleasure and my great honor to welcome Jayati Ghosh. I will give a brief introduction and then Jayati will give a talk. Before we do that, I just want to remind you that this is a recorded lecture, so please be mindful if you don't want to be recorded. The conversation by the end of the talk will be through the Q&A function. So the chat is for technical issues, but if you have questions in the course of the lecture and by the end of the lecture, please use the Q&A function. I will read it out loud and moderate it to give Professor Ghosh an opportunity to answer. So let me start with the introduction. Jayati Ghosh is Professor of Economics at JNU in New Delhi. This is where she's speaking from today. She is a heterodox development economist who is considered one of the world's leading economists today. She has authored and edited a dozen books and hundreds of scholarly articles. Recent books include Demonetization Decoded, a critic of India's monetary experiment, from 2017, the Elgar Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development from 2016, and India and the International Economy from 2015. Professor Ghosh is the recipient of numerous prizes. I'm not going to be able to name all of them. I just picked the most interesting ones. They include an award for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India, the ILO, a Decent Work Research Prize, and the Nord-Sud Prize for Social Sciences. Professor Ghosh was also an advisor for many governments and consulted for several international organizations, including ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD, and UN Women. And she writes regularly for the popular media, including newspapers, journals, and blogs. Given how busy she is, I am particularly grateful for your willingness to come and talk to us, and I'm looking forward for your talk.
Thank you so much, Nitsan. It's a great pleasure to join you, and I've been looking at your program, which looks so utterly interesting that I've been a bit jealous that I haven't been able to attend more of the sessions. But thank you very much for inviting me. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually the implications of state response to COVID-19. I know everybody's already very sick of this pandemic, which it doesn't even look like we're going to be getting out of very soon. But what is particularly interesting for me is not so much the pandemic itself, but the way in which the state responses to it have brought out so much inequality that already existed in our societies and polities under the surface. What the pandemic has done is generate a kind of X-ray of all of these systemic and structural inequalities that we have of gender, of religion, of class, and in India, of caste. And these have been also very evident in the state responses. So I'm going to talk specifically about India, but I think what I'm going to say has resonance in a bunch of other developing countries as well, and possibly also some developed countries. I think India is a very extreme example because we are, in a sense, the global leaders in inequality. We have the most cross-cutting and extreme forms of discrimination and exclusion to be found anywhere in the world. We have deeply hierarchical systems and structures. So in India, we have an extreme form of cross-cutting and intersectional inequality. But I think these things exist in other countries and societies as well. And the state response also indicates that these actually are similar, if not as severe, in other countries. So what the background? The background is that the Indian economy is actually now in a complete and desperate state of devastation. We have had a very stringent lockdown, the most stringent lockdown in the world, imposed very early on. which has completely destroyed the economy and especially informal livelihoods. So we are looking at a dramatic decline in economic activity. We don't have the data yet, but in the last 3 months, economic activity would have fallen by at least 20–30%. And over the year, the expectations are that the decline will be in double digits. Once again, we don't know exactly how much because it still has to play out. But the problem is that all of this has been done without making the situation better in terms of the pandemic. So throughout this very draconian lockdown, the number of cases kept increasing. And we are now in exploding territory. We have the largest number of cases after the US and Brazil. The death rate is still low, but there are many concerns that we are probably undercounting the death. And what is more problematic is that the rate of increase just keeps going up. And so the lockdown and the control and the complete stoppage of economic activity didn't help it to postpone it very long. But when you lift the lockdown, as now the governments are being forced to do simply because you cannot stop economic activity indefinitely, when you do that, you find that the cases then go up exponentially. So we're caught in a kind of double bind, and we are not alone in this. There are other countries that are experiencing similar kinds of situation. As I said, in our case, it's extreme. How did this happen? How do we end up in this peculiar kind of situation? And I would argue there are several reasons and patterns for this, and these are reflected in the government response. But a large part of it is also because that government response was so steeped in inequality, in social and economic inequalities, and in political inequalities. And it's those inequalities that have generated this incompetent response, incompetent in terms of controlling the pandemic, incompetent in terms of managing the economy. So what are these features? Well, the first one has to do with the containment strategy itself. And this is actually something quite common across the developing world. We unthinkingly adopted a containment strategy that is really not suited to a large part of our population. A very, very severe lockdown can be enforced and will not have as damaging the economic consequences if you are able to provide for your workforce in the period when you stop economic activity. But in India, 95% of our workers are on informal contracts. They don't actually have any kind of even written contract that would ensure them any kind of compensation for the incomes that they've lost. Half of our workers are self-employed, so they don't even have an employer whom they can appeal to. And so when you declare a lockdown, you're depriving them of livelihood, but then you must have something to give them for that period when they cannot work. You must have some social protection. We didn't have that. And many countries, many developing countries don't have that either. So we impose a lockdown that causes massive economic distress, and people lose incomes. They actually lose access to food because there are many who are just at that margin of subsistence and survival, who cannot eat. So there's an increase in poverty, an increase in hunger, entirely driven by the lockdown, independent of the disease itself. But more to the point, what are the typical things we're told? First of all, there's that dreadful term social distancing, which I prefer to call physical distancing because that's really what it is. So physical distancing and frequent washing of your hands with soap and water, right? And of course, wearing masks is the new one. Now, of these, physical distancing is difficult, if not impossible, for at least 40% of people in India who live in urban slums or in very packed village areas which are deeply congested. They live in very packed close quarters in small houses with several people to one room and with many people in similar houses or tenements very nearby. It's impossible to keep 2 meters distance apart at all times. It simply can't be done. Access to water is a huge thing. Access to clean water is a major luxury for the poor in India. At least half of the people, households in India, do not have immediate access to piped water. It has to be brought, collected, usually by women and girls, unpaid labor in the household, and stored. And you cannot actually bring and store enough to do frequent washing of hands. In many slums in India and in many other countries as well, people have a few buckets a day for the entire household needs. How can you then devote all of that water to just washing your hands? So these are things that were not thought of when, in fact, all the prescriptions were imposed. That how will actually everyone in society maintain these rules? And what can we do to assist them to maintain these rules? This was not thought of. And so as a result, you end up with most of these people not being able to follow those basic requirements of physical distancing and frequent hand washing, which makes them much more susceptible, obviously. Second is the fact that the Indian government treated this particular pandemic as an opportunity for much greater centralization. Now, India is a federal system. We have the central government and state governments. And health is dominantly a concern of the state governments. But by declaring this a national disaster, the government, the central government, brought everything under its control. And in a way, this could be a good idea because it can actually enable you to coordinate across states and make sure that everything is done properly. But they did not use it to coordinate. Having collected all the powers, they then left states to their own devices. They didn't even transfer enough funds for them to deal with the pandemic. States were told to just find the money wherever they could. And severe limits were there. I mean, the central government still owes the state government's money. So they really were scrounging around, trying to find the resources to deal with the health issues and to deal with the livelihood losses. So what does this do? This created this extraordinary situation where hundreds of millions of migrant workers, first of all, lost their jobs and livelihood. And then, because there was no social protection, they didn't get enough food, rations in the period, they had no incomes. Many of them were then trying to go home, but all transport had been stopped. There was a 4-hour notice given to the entire population before the lockdown, only 4 hours. And then everything was stopped, all public transport, all railways, all buses, all everything. You could not move. It was a crime to be on the roads. It was a law and order problem if you were out on the roads. So there was no means for them, many of them are rural urban migrants, to get back home. In desperation, many of them just started walking hundreds of kilometers. There are tragic stories of 12-year-old girls walking 300 kilometers and then dying just a few hours away from their home out of exhaustion. Mothers giving birth on the road and then carrying the newborn child and continuing to walk for 600 kilometers. Other terrible photographs of little children, a 2-year-old trying to wake up a mother who has died of hunger on a railway platform. And all kinds of human tragedies that are too desperate to enumerate, but it will indicate the kind of extreme pressure that migrant workers faced. Now, here's another example of the inequality. Migrant workers in India were given no help except 2 months later when finally some trains were arranged, which they had to pay for themselves. Migrant workers in India were not assisted to get to their homes, but migrants from India who had gone abroad, who were typically upper class or at least middle class, they were brought back on special evacuation flights arranged by the government. And for the first month, those were free. So there's a clear class dimension to this. The migrants who could afford to travel abroad, they were evacuated by the government and brought back on special flights. The migrants within India who were contributing to building the cities and providing the services and everything, they were left completely on their own. And when they attempted to get home, they were treated like criminals, they were attacked on the roads, they were put into detention centers, and they were made to suffer immense hardship. Now, this particular extreme response of the state would not have been possible unless 2 things exist. One, that there is a middle class and an elite that assumes that this kind of thing is all right, that there's no reason to object or protest or demand that the local migrants must also get their human rights. and that the workers themselves do not expect any better, that they are so used to being denied and betrayed by a system that they take this as part of their fate, that they don't rise up in protest and demand that they get their citizens' rights and their compensation for being denied livelihood and adequate assistance in getting to their homes or any of these things. That reflects a very deep-seated, institutionalized inequality that this government could therefore take advantage of. It's also that which meant that the lockdown did not have to be used to actually do the health preparations that are essential. Now, why do you have a lockdown? Essentially to delay the onset of the disease. And you delay it because you can use that time to create testing kits, to set up a system of testing, tracing the contacts, treating those who are found positive. That's the way to deal with the disease. That requires a lot of public resources, but the purpose of a lockdown is to give you that kind of breathing space where you can do that, set up your testing kits, create the medical facilities, make sure you have enough doctors, nurses, and sanitation workers and other health workers, provide hospital beds, provide the essential equipment, get protective equipment for the health workers. Those are the kinds of things you're supposed to do. The government really didn't bother to do any of that. The state government, some of them were trying to do this on their own. Then the central government, using the Disaster Management Act, said, we will look for the testing kits. You don't have to, you buy them, but we will choose which one. 1 month after the whole process had started, they ordered testing kits. These turn out to be faulty. The whole process has to start again. So testing kits, protective equipment, ventilators, all of the kinds of things that were seen as essential have been extremely delayed and therefore in short supply. And then you've had the kinds of crises that many people across the developing world are now familiar with in terms of inadequate beds, inadequate health workers themselves succumbing to the disease because they are unprotected, and so on and so forth. The timing of all of these processes itself also indicates the class and other socio-economic features of the inequality that actually has determined the state's response. So the first cases of it in India came from, in fact, China, and they came to the state of Kerala in late December, and the first case was isolated in January. And at that time, the state government in Kerala had said, please actually start testing and tracing everyone who's coming in from outside. The government did not do this for another 2 months. So for 2 months, those who had been traveling abroad, who are necessarily in the top 5% of the population, all of them were allowed to come in with very little tracing at all. Really doesn't pick up anything. So the disease was allowed to come from abroad because the basic fact of testing, tracing, and treating when you have very few cases, that was not done. And mind you, these are visitors from abroad who, as I mentioned, will have to come from the top 5% of the population. Once it happens, and once you have these cases, then the attack becomes directed against the poor, as if they are the carriers of the disease. They are the ones who have to be attacked because there have been so many cases across the country of middle-class households not only denying domestic workers entry, but if one of them is infected, then immediately they will blame domestic workers. The domestic worker within the house, the security guard, the gardener. There have been so many cases like this. There have been middle-class housing colonies, as they're called, housing associations that have forbidden domestic workers from using the same lifts and elevators as the residents, or from using a separate staircase, not touching elevator buttons, because they are now treated as carriers of disease when there's nothing. In fact, the disease came from the rich to the poor in India, but the treatment has been essentially of treating the others as the working class as the bearers of this disease. Now, when you do this, that is to say, you prevent workers from getting out to earn their own living, and you prevent them from going home, you necessarily create pockets of infection. Because they're stuck in close quarters, as I mentioned, in very cramped housing. They have no capacity to actually do the physical distancing and all of those other things. And they are starving because for 3 months, they have no access to work or income. So they are very enervated, debilitated, much more susceptible to disease. And finally, therefore, when you allow them to go back, when you finally allow buses, you allow trains, or they walk home, many of them then carry disease. And they carry them to some of the places with the worst health infrastructure in the country, because most of these migrants have come from relatively backward states, relatively deprived economic areas, which are already poor in various kinds of infrastructure. And so now we have the disease spreading like wildfire in states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and other relatively poor areas where health facilities are very, very poor and where the system simply cannot cope. That itself is an indication of that same kind of inequality. Then the shocking thing has been the sheer parsimony of the relief measures. Compared to practically every other government in the world, the Indian government had the most draconian lockdown, the most severe clampdown on economic activity, the most devastating control over all kinds of any kind of ability to earn livelihood. And yet it has provided probably among the least relief. So very little has been provided. The total fiscal spending, the additional spending after the COVID crisis is only about 1% of GDP, which is nothing. Even many other developing countries have done 5-6%. In the developed world, we know the fiscal response is 10-15% of GDP. In India, it's been only around 1%, and very little of that has been directed to the poor. So yet another example of how the inequality has played out is in terms of access to food. In India, we have a public food grain distribution system. It's part of a Food Security Act. And in that, the government collects food grain, basic food grains, wheat, rice, and so on, from farmers and stores, and then distributes in the ration shops. Now, when this crisis happened, everyone expected that there would be a significant distribution of free food grain, because at that time, the government was holding massive surplus food grain, 77 million tons, as opposed to the buffer stock requirement of only 24 million tons. So that's like 50 million tons, more than 50 million tons extra, which you could easily have distributed to compensate those who have been denied livelihood. The government did announce 5 kilograms free of food grain to only those who have ration cards, that is, who are covered under the Food Security Act, but did not think of the 120 million who are excluded from that simply because enough ration cards have not been created and distributed. But what is more to the point is that that's very little for 3 months. And so, in fact, even when it's been sitting on all of this surplus food grain, it's distributed only about 20 million tons of this for this purpose. And in the meantime, because it's collected more as the next harvest came, the winter harvest was brought in, it's now actually increased the buffer stock holding. From 77 million tons, the buffer stock holding has gone up to 100 million tons. When the requirement is 1/4 of that, it's 4 times the requirement. But they are not distributing this because of the class character of the state and the feeling that you can get away with it. And the amazing, appalling thing is that these inequalities are so deep and so sharp that the poor of India seem reconciled to this. They are not demanding that this excess food grain be distributed to them free, as it should be in this time of crisis. They are not demanding an income compensation for the incomes that they have lost. A UBI in this case is absolutely necessary because it's not even just a question of an economic strategy. It's a basic justice, it's natural justice. When you have deprived people of the capacity to earn, you have to provide them something in return. But none of this has been done, essentially because clearly these inequalities are so deeply entrenched that the government thinks it can get away with it, and the people also do not demand that this minimum requirements should be fulfilled. Religious inequalities. This is a government that has been progressively building on religious polarization, and particularly in moving against Muslims who are seen as the other. Before the pandemic, across India, there were widespread protests against a new Citizenship Amendment Act, which actually sought to effectively make Muslims second-class citizens. And this led to a major outbreak of protests across the country, which was not just Muslims, but many young people, women. It was a wonderful flowering of protest. But this shift, this attempt to make Muslims second-class citizens, this has become actually even strengthened during the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, in the middle of March, before it was even illegal, there was a religious gathering in Delhi, and it was not illegal. There was permission. But in that gathering, there were several people. It was a Muslim religious gathering, and there were several people who had come from the Middle East to attend it. And some of them happened to be carriers of COVID-19. So, in fact, about 1,000 people in that gathering were affected by the disease. And because there was not proper information, many of them then went back to their hometowns, and so they spread the disease. This was communalized, is the word we use. This was used as a means of religious polarization by the media, by the government, by the ruling party, by chief ministers and home ministers, who actually accused them of spreading this disease on purpose. So I think, unlike any other country in the world, in India, this virus for several months was actually given a religious overtone, which is unthinkable, but it happened. It's only now, when it has spread to such a degree that it's impossible to claim there is any one religion, that that particular narrative has reduced a little bit. But there are still people who are false, and that's the nature of the kind of polarization that we're getting. Then, of course, the other inequalities that we are experiencing. So the gender inequality is something, again, which has been very sharply evident in the state response. The lockdown meant that everybody was stuck at home. But for many women, home is not necessarily a place of greater safety. And this is particularly true when the men at home are feeling angry and frustrated because they've lost their incomes, and they need someone to actually turn their anger against. This is not unusual to India. We know that across the world, domestic violence has increased during the time of pandemic. But what is terrifying is that the state response to the domestic violence has actually become even more brutal and patriarchal. They have been less inclined to take up cases. Women have often been told to go back and deal with it. Women are even frightened to approach even the police, because they will end up having to go back and stay with the oppressor without any protection. And we have more and more cases even of rape victims, gang rape victims, being accused by the state because they have broken down in court and reacted strongly to judges. We've had cases of even gang rape victims being thrown into jail along with those who were trying to help her. So the state response to gender violence has been extremely patriarchal and has got worse. But the gender gaps emerge also very much in terms of employment and work. We know that disproportionately women have lost their jobs in this pandemic. Already, India had one of the lowest women's work participation rates in the world. It's actually got significantly worse now because more proportionately women have lost jobs in the pandemic and have been denied their livelihoods. But also we know that the frontline workers in this situation are the care workers, are the ones who are dealing with, they are the ones who are directly dealing with the entire health issue and the ones who need the greatest protection. There is a strong hierarchy even within care work. Typically, the men are much more likely to be the doctors, the specialists, and so on. And as you go down the line, when you get to nurses, you get to other care workers, you get to the community health workers, and then finally you get to the sanitation workers. And there you get dominantly more women. In India, the government relies on what you could call para-health workers. And they're not recognized as workers because they're not paid minimum wages. In fact, they get an honorarium, which is something like a quarter of the minimum wage. They have been at the front lines of informing the public, going to deal with those who have the disease, checking out on who is ill and who isn't, and all of these kinds of things. In most cases, they have been denied protective equipment. They have had to carry their own gloves and sanitizers and masks, and they are not given any kind of protection. Disproportionately, they have been affected by the disease, and only some of them are being given health insurance, even by the very state that is using them to do this. The case of sanitation workers brings out another deep divide in Indian society, that of caste. Sanitation workers tend to come from the lowest, most oppressed and discriminated against castes. And we have very, very inhuman practices that persist, including manual scavenging, which still persists across much of the country. We also know that in this particular case, in the case of this disease, the pandemic actually exposes, even human waste has been found to contain the virus, and therefore sanitation workers are very greatly at risk. Sanitation workers are not even protected by the special health insurance scheme that was announced by the government for health workers. Sanitation workers typically have not even been paid in many states because the state governments themselves are reeling under a major fiscal crisis. Sanitation workers are denied basic social protection of any kind, including even security of work. So the fact that this is part of a caste divide is also very much an example of how the existing divides have been massively, not just exposed, but I would say expanded during this period of the pandemic. Finally, there's the broader economic response. And here it's quite, well, not finally, that's the second last point. Here it's quite interesting that the economic response, as I told you, has been very parsimonious in terms of relief, but it's also been very limited in terms of a macroeconomic stimulus. 1% is not going to cut it in terms of an economy that is declining, where you have stopped production, where you have prevented people from working, and where you have basically deprived them of their incomes. 1% of GDP increase in government spending is not going to help. Private investment will not increase if they don't see a market. And in fact, the market today is shrinking, it's not expanding. So the fact that the government has not gone out with a very big public spending is quite extraordinary. But instead, what has it done? It has tried to provide liquidity, mainly to the big players, to the large corporates. It had already extended a large tax cut to large corporates, but it's now trying to entice investment, both domestic private investment and foreign investment, by deregulating other markets. It's trying to deregulate labor markets, and it has several states declared that they would actually get rid of all the existing labor laws in a bid to attract private investment. It's deregulating land markets, and the government has, in the last 3 weeks, dramatically deregulated and reduced all the rules relating to environment. So it is encouraging much more the fossil fuel industries, coal and other industries. It is encouraging the cutting down of forests. It is allowing more pollution of water and the atmosphere in a desperate bid to attract investment, whatever happens. Now, of course, this is bound to fail because investment necessarily will come if there's a market. And it won't go if you're only going to be able to provide very cheap workers who are unhealthy and debilitated and in very poor conditions. It would actually prefer workers with better conditions and higher wages and healthier situations. So it is an attempt that is doomed to fail. But the very fact that the government has chosen this strategy is an indication of the deep inequalities that have pervaded even the thinking of the state. And then, of course, there is the digital divide. Education, like everything else, has moved online. Just like this particular conference has moved online, so across the country, the attempt has been to shift education online. Now, this is almost laughably impossible in a country with such large digital divides. Only 40% of the population actually has smartphones. And most of them certainly do not have laptops and tablets and so on. To expect education from primary school onwards to reach all these people is completely impossible. My own university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, is supposed to be one of the top universities in the country, regularly tops the rankings. We get students from many, many different socio-economic backgrounds and from across the country. We have been told to run online classes, and I have been running classes on Zoom, only to find that about 30% of the students can attend every class. We record these classes, they are available, but in an online survey, we found that 40% of the students could not even access the recorded lecture because they didn't have the bandwidth. You can see how the bandwidth is so poor even in the university that I cannot be visible to you. But these students could not even download a lecture to listen to. And yet we're expecting that they will then be in a position to sit for online exams after these online lectures. This kind of inequality, you can see what it is doing, not just to people in different locations and without access to connectivity, but to the first generation learners, the poor of the country, still about 50% of our student body, who are now basically going to be denied education. And yet the government is not thinking of creative ways of dealing with this. They're basically saying, everybody go online and figure it out yourselves. The last point I want to make is something to do not just so much with inequality, but with the overall state of democracy. And this, I think, is a wider concern. I think this is a global concern. The pandemic has become an opportunity for states to actually become more authoritarian, more controlling, and more able to impose their will and crack down on dissent. In India, this has taken, as usual, an extreme form. We have seen many peaceful protesters, young people, students, women arrested. We have seen many human rights activists and others who were engaged throughout their lives in peaceful protest, incarcerated. And we have seen the spread of disease in the prisons. And yet all of these people are denied bail. There are reports that at least 2 prisons in Assam and Kashmir, half the inmates have contracted this disease. Several of our major poet, philosophers, activists, human rights workers and lawyers have contracted COVID-19 in jail, and the conditions under which they are being kept and treated are horrible and are terrifying, and yet they are not being released. But this is extreme. The more concerning in the longer term aspect has been the fact that attempts to control the pandemic have also involved various digital apps and mobile apps that have institutionalized constant tracking and monitoring of the citizenry. And I think this is a very dangerous trend for the future, because it's basically normalized, because of the fear of the disease, it has normalized a degree of state monitoring, surveillance, and control of the citizens, which would never have been contemplated or accepted in other periods and other times. And having normalized this, we're not really sure whether states will be willing to give up all the power that they have suddenly accumulated. At the same time that we are now handing over knowledge of all our activities, 360-degree knowledge of us to the states, states are becoming more and more opaque. The pandemic has also become an occasion for states to actually reduce their democratic accountability and any kind of auditing and monitoring of their actions. And I think that's a very serious concern, because that too has got medium to long-term implications. It's going to be very hard to rebuild the basic democratic structures that all of us took for granted even a couple of years ago. So we need to think, when we come out of this, how to come out into not a significantly worse, more unequal society, and what we need to do to make, not recover better, I don't think that's the right term really, to actually shift gears, to actually change the way we structure our societies and economies, to make the reduction of these very deep systemic inequalities fundamentally unacceptable. Okay, let me stop here and we can get into discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. Andy, can you maybe try to show our faces again? And Professor Ghosh, maybe you can try to turn on the video again so we can see you.
So here I am again, yes.
Thank you, but I don't see, okay, perfect. Hi everyone, thank you for your patience. So to start the conversation, I would like to invite all of you to use the Q&A button or function and write down your questions that I will deliver to Professor Ghosh. In the time that you might want to take to ask the questions, I have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. Although we have a comment. Someone is thanking you for an interesting session. No questions yet. So I would like to ask you two questions that are a little bit prescriptive in nature, but I've been struggling with them myself and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. The first one goes to the earlier issue that you brought up, which is the inappropriateness of some of the technologies and some of the practices that are suggested that take what can be in some way implemented in high-income countries and much more difficult to implement in low-income countries, such as washing your hands, etc. And this takes us back to the 1970s and the conversation about appropriate technologies, right? How do you navigate between global best practices and science and implementation on the ground? And I was wondering if you thought about what the appropriate technologies would be, right? I mean, so you talked about contact tracing, epidemiological and digital, and we were talking about testing, but these are still the best practices that are out there. I was wondering if you thought a little bit about how to implement issues such as hand washing. That was my first question. Since there are other questions, I will wait with the other one. And you know what, let me collect another one just in case. Akash Natash is asking, is Aadhaar used for surveillance in the pandemic? Is there any electronic system is used? So Aadhaar is the social welfare system, and it would be great to figure out how data collection on behalf of welfare is used or not used for this.
Yes, so, you know, in terms of the methodologies for containment, I think it's absolutely right what you're saying, that it's not just enough for us to say this won't work. We have to suggest what will work. And here, the Indian state of Kerala is actually quite an interesting example, because what they said from the very beginning is that, look, this is a disease that is coming from outside. Let's track everybody who's coming from outside. We will test them and we will isolate them. And so when there are relatively few, you can do that. And you can actually try and control it in that way. It's only when it has grown beyond a point and you get to the point of, say, community transmission that that does not work. But even in those cases of community transmission, ultimately, of course, you ask everyone to keep minimum a some distance, you ask them to wear masks, you do all of that. But you know that that is not going to be enough, and many of them will not be able to do that. So you actually do a lot more tracing, and you make sure that it is not something for which there's a lot of social stigma. So people are not afraid to go and be tested, and they're not going to be, ostracized by everyone and so on. So countries like Vietnam and Thailand, which have had very few cases actually, and very few deaths, in Thailand, they haven't really practiced any of those things because there is a very good public health system. Everybody can walk in and get tested. And those who get tested immediately then are isolated and treated. So there hasn't been an explosion of cases without all of these requirements, which are extremely rigid and which cannot be met in urban slum situations or in very congested situations. The second question about Aadhaar. So the Aadhaar has been a source of grave concern for many of us for two reasons. It's used to provide social welfare benefits and even your wages in the employment guarantee scheme and everything. And the problem is that it is simultaneously an exclusionary force and a surveillance force. It's exclusionary because, it relies on biometrics, which depend on so many things, on the machine working properly, on whether your fingerprints haven't changed in the interim. And if you do manual work, the chances of your fingerprints changing are very, very high. And so there are many cases of people being denied their wages, being denied their food rations because the Aadhaar doesn't match. So it's been a very strong exclusionary process. But at the same time, the Aadhaar is linked to your bank account and it's linked to everything after that. And the trouble is that the Aadhaar data is very easily leaked. There have been n number of cases of Aadhaar numbers and data being out on websites and leaked to people and being used in all kinds of ways. There are even fears that it's being used in periods of religious tension to identify which communities live where so that they can be targeted. So there are many concerns with Aadhaar. It's not at all clear that it helps in terms of, it's also based on the idea that people are fundamentally dishonest, and so you have to keep tracking them to make sure they behave. And whereas I don't think that's the case. I think it's possible to deliver public services with some modicum of trust. But in the pandemic, the government has brought in another mobile app, Arogya Setu. It's called Health Bridge. And that you're supposed to carry around and keep it on at all times in case someone near you has got this disease. It's ridiculous, it doesn't work, and very few people use it.
I'm going to combine two questions that ask about protest and solidarity. So Mahatal is asking, what prospects do you see, if any, for the protest activity that was taking place against the CAA and more broadly before the pandemic resuming as things reopen? Or has the hoof now been taken out of the movement by the lockdown and the crackdown on the leaders? Would be terrible for that blooming of solidarity that we saw at that time to be squandered, but would be curious for your thoughts on whether it has or hasn't been. And a related question is regarding the digital and political concerns you raised, what do you suggest to the citizens around the world to act proactively against authoritarian behavior? So that's a larger maybe question.
So, the Indian case is very interesting. I mean, certainly the attempt of the government is to actually just snuff out all possibilities of protest. That's why so many people who have had nothing to do with any kind of violence, who are all peaceful, are being threatened, locked up, have cases against them. There were riots in Delhi, which were very clearly instigated by proponents of the ruling party. There are videos of them exhorting their followers to go out and shoot people. And after that, their followers have gone out and shot. But they have not been touched. On the other hand, the people who were shot, they have been arrested. The people who were sitting peacefully on protest, they have been arrested. And so it's very clear, the government's aim is to actually terrorize everybody into submission. Now, I think this can work for a while. And of course, it can work now because of the pandemic, because of the fear of the disease, which has already inhibited movement, restricted mobility, and all of that. But it can't work indefinitely. All these people who protested, they are just quiet. They haven't gone away. They're still feeling, and in fact, if anything now, they're feeling the injustice even more, because they're seeing the people around them who were actually completely peaceful are the ones being targeted. So I don't think this is something that they can just snuff out as they hope. They are trying to make it a religious issue. They're trying to make it, us versus them. But I think this can only last for a certain point. And also when you're so completely incompetent on the basics in terms of, not just the economy, but the survival of human life, when you're so incompetent in ensuring those, then I don't think the Indian people will allow it for that long. Even if at the moment it's true that for some reason the Prime Minister has this extraordinary, apparently, charisma which allows him to persuade people that he's doing everything for their best. I don't think that can be sustained indefinitely. And I suspect that it's obviously not immediate. It's not that, you lift the lockdown and everything starts happening again. But the very fact that there is this generalized incompetence, along with a generalized repression, I think that does bring about every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. And I think that will happen.
We have two, again, related questions about the issue of the state and then a follow-up. So the issue about the state capacity, Dustin Avent-Holt is thanking you for a fantastic and thought-provoking talk. Dustin also says, it seems that the core of your argument is that entrenched inequalities lead to state failure in addressing COVID-19. I wonder if the underlying problem really is state failure itself, which has produced both the inequalities that exacerbate COVID-19 and the failed response to combating transmission. State failure have produced the slums in which containing transmission is difficult, but it has also depleted resources in the state that can be used to adequately contain virus transmission. And there's more to that. Oh, let me continue. So is the underlying problem really just state failure, which has produced both inequalities and inadequate responses? And also, Dustin wonders how well this model explains other country contexts. Do you think this is a general pattern where nation states with high level of inequalities and other under-resourced states have been the worst of containing transmission? A related question, and you don't have to answer the specifics necessarily. Pranav says, we have examples of sustainable livelihoods practiced by local communities using the Gram Sabha to become self-sufficient, yet we see the state trying to sell off public commons for commercial mining in the name of being Atmanirbhar. Isn't the Indian state itself destroying the capacity to build local and sustainable jobs in rural areas, forcing people to migrate due to displacement? And there's a continuation to that, but I will stop here. It's a big question.
Well, I think the answer to the second question, yes, absolutely yes. The Indian state is responsible, complicit, very much part of that problem. Having said that, it's a very dynamic and complex dialectical thing, isn't it? It's not that, the chicken and egg business, but I would say that state failure is often in some cases a symptom of the broader political economy, which includes the kinds of structural and systemic inequality. The inability of states to address those inequalities, or the unwillingness of the state to address those inequalities, is a reflection of their class character and their caste character or their patriarchal character and so on. I would say it's the other way. Let's think of it this way. Which are the countries that have handled this pandemic relatively well? They include, let's say, New Zealand, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on, right? These are relatively equal societies. They may have other issues, but they are definitely much more equal than countries that have clearly been disastrous in handling the pandemic. The obvious ones are the United States, Brazil, India, Russia. So there is something about very unequal societies also that happen to be run by very macho authoritarian men who are less able to actually deal with something like a pandemic. I think there's a broader, if I could say, I mean, or not broader, there's a general pattern to this. Certain kinds of governments, especially those run by, as the kind of leader I have just outlined, the macho authoritarian type, they are used to a combination of terror, manipulation, and basically terror and manipulation to keep the population under their control. Now, certain things you can't do that. The economy, basically, it's going to operate according to certain rules. You cannot terrorize it. You cannot let the media deal with it. You cannot manipulate it. It's going to operate according to these rules. The virus. You can't terrorize the virus. You can't manipulate the virus. You can manipulate data about the virus, but you cannot actually manipulate the actual trajectory. And I think that's the problem. They don't have any other model of dealing with it. Now, is that state failure or is that a reflection of a particular political economy? I think, that's complicated. There are different kinds of state failure. Some are just complete state failure because of complete absence of resources. That's a different kind of state failure. But this is a particular kind, which reflects, as I said, a very particular political economy, which is not confined to India, but obviously global in that sense.
The last question.
I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
Time for, which exactly follows up on the issue of authoritarian men, is Daniel Drishol is asking whether there is any significant public opinion shift in regard to Modi and BJP because of the pandemic.
It's very hard to say because, first of all, the control over mainstream media is unbelievable. Most mainstream media in India is completely under the sway of the ruling party and will not, will be completely obsessed with criticizing the opposition for everything, including what's happening in the country today. They will blame the opposition for even the health system and so on. In addition, the BJP is really adept at social media. It's made that a major plank of its strategy. And so they have social media armies whom they partly fund. Millions of people, actually. It's one of the big employment, part-time employment things, to constantly send WhatsApp messages, constantly operate on Twitter, constantly troll people who disagree, and constantly spread a particular kind of message. So there is a very strong, I would call it, misinformation campaign, which is ongoing. Having said that, people are not so foolish as to be completely in that way indefinitely. So I think there is a lot of recognition of the failures. They're still unwilling to accept that they messed it up so badly that they gave them a second term to do all of this and so on. But it's really the fact that they seem to be messing up pretty much everything they touched. Foreign relations, we're now on terrible terms with all of our neighbors. We have border disputes with all of them. The economy is beyond description. The health system is a disaster. The environment is a mess. Climate change is upon us without any redressal. So, there's a mess up on multiple fronts. And there is dissatisfaction. A lot of it is contained because of this oppression and the suppression. But that dissatisfaction will eventually come out. I think that is, by the way, also true for other similar kinds of states and rulers. And I just want to end with a question that I didn't answer fully earlier about, digital authority. In a way, the role of this kind of digital monitoring and surveillance and the difficulties of democratic dissent. What do we do? What do we as citizens across the world, how do we deal with this new world? And I think we have to learn as citizens ourselves to become much more creative in the kinds of ways in which we think of our expressing and mobilizing our dissent. but also we have to be much more open about the coalitions that we're willing to build. We have to stop, let's face it, all of us are sectarian in our own little ways. I mean, I'm a feminist and I'm a leftist, and I know how tough it is to get groups together. And we have to learn to be able to engage in much wider coalitions, because many different kinds of people are affected by this kind of governance. And we have to take all of them on board.
Professor Ghosh, thank you so much. That was a very illuminating and great talk. We are out of time, but thank you again, and thank you for your patience with the digital and equalities. And thank you to the audience for being with us, and thank you, Andy, for making this work.